Okay. So, chapter 11, we're going to be speaking entirely about fitness. And this might surprise you because we have covered fitness a fair bit. We've calculated absolute fitness and relative fitness and discussed some of the concepts and issues that you need to consider when you're comparing or assessing the fitness of a particular organism and specifically a particular genotype within a species. And so, as you know already, there are a number of factors that contribute to how we might quantify the fitness of an organism. One of those being reproductive output. That's one we've hit on pretty hard and discussed quite a bit. Um, but look, we're going to dive into this a good bit deeper and think more carefully about other things that are less obvious that certainly contribute to the fitness of an individual. One of those is, of course, lifespan. And we haven't really spoken much about how lifespan contributes to fitness of an organism, but that's certainly something we're going to get into here shortly. And then also, we need to think about life history strategies for organisms. And that's a term that I haven't used all that well, but or often in this class. But we are going to dig into exactly what life history means and start thinking about population level processes that occur within species that contribute to their survival and fitness as a species. So, expanding upon this a bit, thinking about lifespan, how long an organism lives, it makes sense, presumably to you, that the longer an organism lives, there's a good likelihood that will have the opportunity to produce more and more offspring, therefore increasing its fitness. Now, what kind of lifespans are there? We think frequently about our own lifespan and perhaps that of our pets, our cats, our dogs, right? And those are measured in years and usually decades, infrequently for humans, centuries. Okay. So you can expect to live, many tens of years, possibly 100 years. Um, but that's much longer than you would expect your dog to live or your cat to live. I unfortunately have dogs that appear to be immortal and they're living a lot longer than I would like them to. I love my dogs, but I'm ready to have fewer dogs. So we think about lifespan quite frequently. So, what are lifespans out there in the natural world? Well, we think of them having a very finite timeline, right? I am definitely Dr. Noonan. I'm not going to be here, you know, 90 years from now. Not going to happen. Okay. So there's some limitation to my lifespan. Okay. Uh, there's a there are species that have what appears to be an almost unlimited lifespan, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So, what happens as we approach that limit to our lifespan? That's a term that we use called senescence, and we'll dig into senescence. And factors involved in fitness related to lifespan are reproductive output. And there are many different approaches that different organisms take to reproduction. Some species produce offspring only once during their life. Other species will produce offspring multiple times. And different species, as we will discuss and review, put a different amount of effort and resource into each individual offspring. And that too is a life history factor that affects the fitness of a particular genotype. So we'll discuss different life history strategies, whether an organism is a specialist or a generalist, and how that contributes to fitness, and then dig into some population level processes. Okay. So if we're thinking about fitness and the fact that selection presumably purifies populations with respect to existing variation and drives those populations towards being more and more fit, better and better adapted to their environment, assuming suitable variation within the population exists or is generated through the process of mutation, and these traits are subject to selection, you would think that why don't all organisms have maximal fitness and all produce many, many, many offspring every year and live forever? That would seem to be the trait that would have the highest fitness. So, why is that not the case? Why does selection not always lead to longer life and, as millions of offspring for all species? So let's first think about lifespan. And your text has a really interesting figure here that shows some different organisms with very different lifespans. Here in figure A, you can see a bristlecone pine tree. These trees live an extraordinarily long time, and this tree is believed to be the oldest single individual organism. I'll give you an example of something that might be slightly different here in a minute, much older. But this tree is over 5,000 years old. This single tree has been growing in that place, that specific tree, for more than 5,000 years. Contrast that with figure B, where you have a small species of plant that is an annual, right? It grows in the spring, much like many plants might be around your house or your apartment right now. They grow, they produce flowers, they drop seeds, and they die off as the weather gets cold. And in the winter, there are no individuals. There are only seeds in the soil waiting to grow. So these are annual species that come back every year. Contrast that with the coral that you see in figure C. Now, coral might be considered to be almost immortal, okay? And we'll talk a bit more about that here in a second. But these coral can live certainly for thousands and thousands of years, simply growing, as you see this coral head growing here. And then figure D, a rotifer, a small aquatic organism that lives no longer than, say, 20 days. So these ranges of lifespans for different organisms are enormous, and certainly much more than you might have expected given, the lifespans that we commonly think of. Like I said, your goldfish, your cat, your dog, right? So let's talk about some of these unusual situations, like I just mentioned. The fact that coral might be immortal. How might they be immortal? Well, each of these corals, any coral head you see growing on the ocean floor like this, they're subject to a lot of wave action. Maybe some snorkeler from a cruise ship swings by and kicks it with their flippers and breaks a piece off. Okay. Now, unlike you, if you break a limb off and it falls to the ground, it's not going to grow into another version of you. Coral, on the other hand, if you break a piece of that individual coral off, it will fall to the rocks nearby and grow into another coral head. It is genetically identical. It's a clone of the original. And so in this way, it's believed that individual corals that are living today are quite possibly, many of them, thousands and thousands, possibly tens of thousands of years old, because they have simply been growing, breaking, and growing from those broken fragments. This is evidenced in what you might see if you go into a fancy saltwater fish shop. I grow coral in my fish tank at home, and when my coral gets too big, it's outgrowing the aquarium, I can snap a piece off, glue it to one of these little discs, and it grows into another coral that I can just give to somebody else that wants to grow that coral. Okay, this is what you might see in an aquarium store where they have hundreds of different corals that people are growing, and you just break a piece off and it grows into another individual that's genetically identical. Okay, so you can see how these individual corals could go on and on and on for millennia without senescing. Okay, and that's the important part. What doesn't happen with these coral is that the longer they live, the weaker their immune systems get, the slower they grow, right? As you and I get older, we don't do things as well, right? Our bones are more fragile, our immune systems are weaker, and we simply aren't capable of doing the same things we were able to when we were younger. Our bodies senesce, okay? That doesn't necessarily happen in all species. So now let's turn our attention to variation in reproductive output, okay? And the term that we use that describes the productivity, the reproductive productivity of an organism is fecundity. So fecundity describes basically how many offspring are produced, Okay. And here we have two extremes within mammals. You see an elephant that produces but a single offspring going through 2 years of pregnancy before producing that one individual offspring. Contrast that with a pig that has well over a dozen offspring, and the pregnancy lasts a very short period of time. Okay? So these are two very different strategies. Why don't elephants have dozens of offspring every year? They would have lots and lots of fitness, right? If they did that. But we need to remember as we think about these differences in fecundity, even in relatively closely related organisms like mammals, the pig and the elephant, there are different considerations in their different environments, right? So, what is it going to mean for that elephant if instead of having one offspring, she has 12? Is she going to have 12 offspring that are as big as this one next to her side now? No, presumably they would have to be much smaller simply for her to carry them. How are those little tiny baby elephants going to do in the wilds of Africa? Well, I'll leave you to think about that, but just recognize that these differences in fecundity, just like many of these other aspects that contribute to the absolute fitness of an organism, are driven not just by need to live longer, need to have more offspring. It's all in the context of their environment and their natural history. So here your text provides 4 different examples of reproductive output. One in a vertebrate, so in the bottom right you'll see an x-ray of a kiwi, a bird from New Zealand that is flightless and lays but one egg, one enormous egg that weighs approximately 25% of its body weight. Okay. You'll see in the top right in B, coconut palm. These are enormous seeds that weigh sometimes up to 2 kilos. So that's a 4-pound seed, right? Contrast that with seeds that you're familiar with, maybe even an acorn. Why are coconuts so large? Why do they have this large fibrous husk around them, which contains a lot of air? And then they have this large liquid chamber in the middle with a large airspace. Why might they need a lot of air? It's because of where they live in coastal environments. Coconuts float, and they can, large seeds float better and can disperse to other islands and wash up on other beaches and have a better chance of survival. Okay? In the top left, you'll see 2 different oysters releasing their offspring into the water. When I say offspring, I mean sperm and egg. So these are just releasing sperm, releasing egg into the water column. These things come together, form zygotes, and those zygotes float around in the ocean until some of them settle somewhere, establish themselves, and grow into an adult individual. This is a very different approach than that taken by the coconut, right? You can see in the bottom left, here we have a seed bank of a poplar tree. And these trees produce, unlike coconuts, they produce very small fibrous seeds that are very light because those seeds disperse very differently from that of the coconut palm. These seeds are light so that they can blow long distances away from the parental tree. Okay? You might think to yourself, why would it be beneficial for the seeds to disperse far away from their parents? Okay? That's a critical concept that you should understand at this point. What is the benefit if you are a plant that releases pollen or has a pollinator that comes and grabs your pollen and takes it to other trees or plants to pollinate them with your pollen? Do you want to be close to your parents? Do you want your offspring to be close to you? Okay, so think about that. That's another aspect of the life history of these organisms that contributes to their fitness and drives these differences. Okay, so we've spoken a bit about fecundity. Now let's think to when organisms reproduce and how often they reproduce. Okay, because as you might imagine, there are some organisms that like you, humans, don't reproduce all that early. Okay. Whereas some organisms, like an aphid, if you have a grandmother or a mother or a parent, or a friend that's a gardener and loves their rose bushes, you'll often hear them cursing the aphids that plague these plants. They're small insects that literally drain the life out of rose bushes. And aphids they're remarkable organisms that can be born already pregnant, okay, because they can self. They're hermaphroditic. So, in any case, that's an extreme example of how early some organisms reproduce. They reproduce immediately or within a few days of being born. Or in the case of these two different fish that I'm contrasting, the crappie that you might catch in Sardis Lake breed at 2 to 3 years of age. The Chilean sea bass that has become incredibly popular on restaurant menus here in the United States. This is an organism that some folks are very concerned about conservation wise because they take so long to reach reproductive age. So they do not begin reproducing until they are 10 years of age. So when an organism reproduces, is a very important component of their life history strategy and contributes to their fitness. Now, what I'm giving you here are two different species that reproduce at different points in their life, right? Crappie reproducing much earlier, Chilean sea bass reproducing much later in life. But recognize, I haven't told you anything about how long these live. And Chilean sea bass certainly live a lot longer than crappie. And so there are factors that contribute to this timing of reproduction. And there are some trade-offs that need to be made that we're going to dig into it. And they help us understand why evolution has driven earlier reproduction in some species and later reproduction in others. And we'll get to that towards the tail end of this lecture. Okay. Now, how often do organisms reproduce? Here I've got two different extremes. On the left is an agave plant, and you can see its large inflorescence, that this is the fruiting body where the flowers are, where the seeds come from. This is how an agave plant reproduces, and they do this once in their life. These plants grow to an enormous size over many, many years, and then at some point they produce this inflorescence. That's their one shot. They're done. They then die. Okay? So they grow for a long period of time, and if they're not chopped up and used to make tequila, they produce a single inflorescence, breed once, and die, and produce an enormous number of offspring. Contrast that with the plant on the right. This is a common aloe. So if you rub aloe on your sunburn, right, that's a product that comes from a plant. And an aloe plant looks quite similar to an agave. And they produce a similar flowering spike that shoots up out of the top of the plant. But unlike agave, aloe do not die after they reproduce. They can reproduce multiple times throughout their life. So again, we're seeing all these difference in life history strategies, even in similar species. So we're seeing different fecundities in mammals. We're seeing different age at which reproduction begins in fishes. We're seeing different once or multiple reproductive events in the lifespan of a plant. Okay, and these are organisms that, they're relatively closely related, but have very different life history strategies. And these strategies are all the result of long periods of selection that have optimized fitness of each of these species. It's just making clear that the same thing is not good for every species. Doesn't like me to go backwards. I accidentally advanced. Okay, so we're going to think about the age when reproduction starts, when it ends. We're going to consider fecundity, so the number of offspring, and then how many offspring are they having at each age, right? Think about an organism that reproduces more than once throughout its lifespan. And so maybe consider a dog that lives for 10 years. It's not going to reproduce its first year. It might reproduce its second year, its third year, its fourth year, fifth year, and then no more after that. So it reproduces for these 4 years, ages 2 through 5. Okay. Each of those years, do you think they're going to produce the exact same number of offspring each year? Probably not. Why not? Because they're continuing to grow throughout that period. And as they grow, get larger, they're able to produce more offspring. They're able to provide for more offspring. As they get much older and are still producing offspring, presumably they're going to taper off and not produce as many as they would have in their prime. Okay? So we need to think about age-specific fecundity if an organism reproduces more than once. We also need to consider age-specific survival rates. Okay, and that's something that's a little more difficult to explain. We'll see it in a table that's coming up. But an age-specific survival rate is how likely is an individual that's born this year, how likely are they to be alive next year? Okay, we're going to, let's say 20% of individuals die. So every individual has about an 80% chance of making it through year one. And then of those 80% that survive, what are the chances that each of them survives through year two? Okay, let's say again, 80% of them make it. Okay, so 80% of that 80%, you can see where this is going. The numbers decrease dramatically over time because each year there's some probability of surviving to the next year. Okay, and it's never 100%. Every individual is not going to make it from age 3 to 4 or 4 to 5. And so there are age-specific survival rates that we need to consider when we're calculating and discussing fitness in this much more detailed and detailed way, considering a much broader view of the contributors to the fitness of an organism. Okay. And so in thinking about that fitness and thinking about how an organism is selected upon to optimize its fitness over time. Okay, so population subject to selection. There's individual variation within that population, and selection acts on those that, and favors those that have the optimal balance of survival and reproductive success. Now, I want you to think about, look at figure 1 and think about an organism. Let's just think about an individual for a moment that is securing resources. Okay, and we have locus A that is associated with the acquisition of resources. So this locus A might have different alleles. Some alleles make individuals better at securing resources. Some alleles might make individuals not so great at securing these resources. What do we need these resources for? This is for growth and development. Okay, so we're basically talking about food. Okay, think of this as, are individuals able to get enough food? And this is genetically determined by locus A. So some individuals are better getting food, some individuals are not as great at it. Okay, so think about what that means. If some individuals are great at getting food, they grow faster, they get bigger sooner. Okay, if they're not as great at getting food, they struggle to grow and develop at the rate that others in the population are. So you can imagine how selection would work on a trait like that. Those individuals that get bigger, faster, get stronger, faster, they're likely to be able to produce more offspring. They're likely to have better survival and be able to reproduce at all. Okay, so you can think about that proceeding along the upper branch of this green tree. You can think about it as a tree. It's certainly not a phylogeny. But along branch X, the resources are allocated to maintenance, survival, and growth, right? So each of you is still young. You are still allocating many of your resources to growth in addition to maintenance and survival, okay? So when you eat a meal, you are allocating those that nutrition to growth, as well as, let's say, healing a cut on your arm and making your heart beat, right? All of those things are where the nutrients that you take into your body go to, okay? I, being much older than you, am not growing anymore. So I am not allocating resources to growth any longer. I'm simply allocating all resources to maintenance and survival, okay? Now, organisms don't allocate all resources throughout their lifespan to just growth, survival, and maintenance. There's the reproductive component as well, okay? And in this example that your text provides, we're thinking also about another locus, B, that governs the allocation of resources to reproduction. Okay, reproduction or maintenance, survival, and growth. Okay, so we have locus A. Do you get lots of resources or not all that many? How good are you at getting them? Locus B. How do we allocate resources to maintenance, growth, and survival or to reproduction? Okay, and so some organisms, some individuals that are in this population that varies for locus B might allocate more to reproduction than other individuals with different genotypes for B. Okay, so there's variation in the population for A, there's variation in the population for B. Okay, now what you might be realizing now is that all the resources that are taking in, there's some finite number. Okay, and if you allocate all of them throughout your life to maintenance, survival, and growth, you'll have no reproductive success. If you allocate all resources to reproduction, you'll have low maintenance, survival, and growth allocation, low to no. So you won't survive, you won't grow, you will have poor maintenance of your body, and you're also going to have very poor fitness, very low reproductive success. Okay? So there's a trade-off. You've got to allocate resources to both of these things, but when you allocate resources to those things, and how much you allocate to each are critically important. Okay, so you have to realize that if you're allocating resources to reproduction, it necessarily comes at the expense of applying those resources or allocating those resources to maintenance, survival, and growth. And this is the reason if you have a puppy or a dog that you want to breed and have puppies, you don't let that dog breed during its first heat. It may come into heat at 6 months or 9 months of age. Okay, that puppy, a female dog, let's say it's a female, she is still allocating many of her resources to growth. Okay, if she is impregnated at that early age, she is biologically obliged to begin allocating resources to reproduction that she would not have done otherwise. Okay, and that comes at the cost, the expense of growth at that critical time period. Okay, that can't be made up later in life. Okay, so you can see down in figure B, there's a trade-off in selection for locus A and locus B. So I encourage you to read this section of the text and review figure B with the context I've just provided for you, and make sure you understand this. Okay, so as we think about this diversion of resources that are allocated to either growth, maintenance, survival, or reproduction, there's a great example in the text that empirically demonstrates the actual cost of reproduction. Okay, it does cost an organism resources that they could otherwise put into growth when they reproduce. And the research project that is cited in the textbook is one in which researchers studied a group of lizards called anoles. You'll see one in the top right. And these are New World lizards, so they're found throughout the Americas and quite abundant and diverse in the Caribbean. And what they did is they collected lizards and did surgery on all of them. And in half of those, these are all female lizards, I'm sorry, half of those females, they removed the ovaries, so they would never reproduce. The other half, they did the surgery, looked at the ovaries, closed them back up. Okay, so this was a control for if they saw an effect in those individuals that they removed the ovaries from, they wanted to make sure the effect they saw was due to removal of the ovaries, not simply because, yeah, you remove the ovaries, but the response is also because you caught them and cut them open. So all the lizards were cut open and put back together. Those that had their ovaries removed are in blue, OVX. Sham refers to fake surgery, basically. Okay. Now I want you to look at the graph on the left. These are measures of growth for each of these treatment groups over 2 years in the study. So on the left axis, left y-axis, look at the snout vent length. So how long the lizard is. Okay. The change in snout vent length, the blue line is higher than the red line. What this means is those lizards that had their ovaries removed grew longer. The change in snout vent length is greater than in the red group, the group that was surgically operated on but closed back up and presumably was out there mating and having offspring. Mass changed as well. Okay, you can see the blue bar for mass is much higher than the red bar for mass. Okay, again, they gained much more weight, much more mass over this study period than did the sham red group. And survival, look at these differences in survival. Okay, in both years of the study, 2007 and 2008, look at the survival of those that retained their ovaries quite low versus those individuals that did not have ovaries, right? It's not like not having ovaries makes you fast or allows you to escape from predators more easily. It's just you're putting every resource you have into maintenance, survival, and growth. Okay? So this is a clear illustration of the balance between those two things, those two ways in which resources can be allocated in that green dichotomy on the previous slide. So let's come back to this consideration of how often organisms reproduce. I gave you these two examples, reproducing once, reproducing more than once. The terms we use to describe this are semiparous and iteroparous. Okay? That might be easiest to remember if you know what iteration means. An iteration is like a repeated thing over and over and over. So that might help you remember iteroparous versus semiparous. So in this example here, I'm going to present to you the way we calculated R for a situation like this, where reaching reproductive age, they have a probability of 80%, each individual, of reaching that reproductive age. Each individual that does reproduce has 10 offspring. So if we multiply those two numbers, we get an absolute fitness of 8, right? And in calculating relative fitness, we would compare the R's of different genotypes and see who had the highest relative fitness. Now, the reason we're going through this again now is because I want you to begin thinking about what if organisms reproduce multiple times throughout their life and they postpone reproduction until some age when they're done allocating all of their resources to growth. Let's look at a situation like that here. So in this example, we have an organism that lives through to year 1, to year 2, to year 3, and to year 4. Okay? And so it lives to a very specific age. It has some certain probability of reaching that age. So every individual that's born reaches age 0. That's why the probability of living to age 0 is 1. Every individual does. Only 75% of individuals make it to 1 year of age, 50% to 2 years of age, 25% to 3 years of age, and none of them make it to 4. Okay? So living to 4, not an option. These organisms live 3 years. All right. Now, how many offspring do they have? Well, when they're born, they have 0. At year 1, they have 0. Okay? They wait until their second year to reproduce. So in year 2, they produce on average 1 offspring. All right? And so since 50% of individuals reach year 2, and all of those have 1 offspring, the calculation that we would use is 0.5 times 1. So the product of those two numbers is 0.5. Now in year 3, only 25% of individuals live to year 3. Each individual that does produces on average 2 offspring. So again, we multiply 0.25 times 2 and we get 0.5. So no individuals live to age 4. So if we sum together the average reproductive output of every individual in the population over time, right? Some die, some don't reproduce. Some live only to age 2 and produce 1 offspring. Some live to age 3 and produce 2 offspring and having produced 1 the year before, our sum R is 1 for this genotype. Okay? So this is how we would calculate the fitness of a genotype that reproduces multiple times. Okay? And I want you to note here that longevity beyond 3 years, if there's no reproduction, wouldn't be selected for. So this is something to think about, right? Why doesn't selection push for infinite lifespan? Why don't we live longer than, say, 100 years? Okay? Well, if we don't reproduce after, let's say, 50, there's no selective advantage to us living longer, right? If I only survived to 50 and you survived to 99, neither of us are reproducing beyond that point. You won't produce more offspring between 50 and 99 than I did up until the point of 50. Okay? And so you won't have higher fitness because you lived longer than me. It doesn't affect your fitness. Okay? So this is a critical point to think about. The fact that living beyond reproductive age would not be selected for. There's no selective advantage of it. You don't gain fitness if you're living longer just for the sake of living longer without producing offspring. Okay? Now, this is an example presented in your text that compares 2 different mutations that confer an increased reproductive output. Okay? Now, these are using the same years, so this organism only lives 3 years, the same survival rate, 1, 0.75, 0.5, and 0.25 for each year. But then look at the reproductive output, okay? Reproductive output in year 2 with the first mutation jumps to 1.2. So they have slightly more offspring on average in their second year than the first example we tried or calculated. And they have the same number 2 in year 3, okay? So if we multiply this out and sum the numbers up, the R of this genotype, this mutation, is 1.1. Look at the next table to the right, a second mutation that provides the same increase in reproductive output, but it provides that increase in year 3 rather than year 2. A year makes a difference, okay? If you calculate this out, you will see that the R of this genotype is 1.05. Getting more offspring out earlier is better for your fitness than producing more offspring later, okay? And if you've ever spoken to somebody that starts telling you, even at your young age, that you should begin saving for your retirement, it's this very principle that applies. That the earlier you start accumulating interest, in the case of your retirement account, or in this case, offspring, who are themselves producing offspring, your fitness is significantly higher, okay? Or your retirement account is significantly larger, okay? So there's a huge difference here in the number of offspring that each of these genotypes will have next year, and then the year after that, and the year after that. Okay, I encourage you to think critically about what this would look like after 30 years. How many individual descendants each of these 3 genotypes we've talked about, the one on the previous slide and then on this slide. Okay, just think about how that number increases almost exponentially over time. Okay, all right. Now we're going to consider selection for senescence. Why is it that organisms do senesce? Why do I not maintain the ability to do the things I could do when I was younger, right? And as you get older and as you interact with your parents as they age, you'll notice that they are not capable of doing the things they used to do in the past. And that's because of a couple things that drive this process of senescence. And the first of them is mutation accumulation. So mutations that reduce our function, our fitness, my ability to do things as I age, okay? If I have mutations that make it hard for me to do things in my older age, let's say my cartilage it doesn't last my entire life, so it makes it harder for me to walk or climb mountains when I'm 50 or 60, okay? Mutations that cause that difficulty in me, they do not affect my fitness because they don't start bothering me until after I'm done reproducing, okay? So the later in life these mutational effects appear, the less impact they have on our fitness. And this means that they are not under selection to be removed from the population. There's no reason for selection to remove something that makes me gimpy when I'm old, right? Let's say, we're back in Africa and I can't get away from the lions because I'm too damn old and slow. Okay? Doesn't matter because I'm not reproducing any longer. Selection, lions, don't remove my alleles for senescence from the population because I've already passed them on to all the offspring I'm ever going to have. The other principle described here is antagonistic pleiotropy. And we've talked about pleiotropy in the past, right? The interaction of different genes, okay? But what we have here is antagonistic pleiotropy, okay, where they're working against one another, okay? And what this means is that mutations or alleles that drive early reproduction, so make your babies early and often, okay, they reduce the probability of survival later. Remember that principle that we discussed of allocation of resources. So if selection is favoring, as I just showed you on the previous slide, earlier reproduction, okay, if selection's favoring that, that comes at the expense of me allocating resources to maintenance and growth early on. And so I'm not keeping as good care of my body long term, and that leads to me senescing over time. So your text provides a figure that shows an example of each of these populations, and I encourage you to review these examples and ensure that they make sense to you in the context of mutation accumulation and antagonistic pleiotropy as I've described them to you here. All right, so now we're going to think about populations, not just individuals and how well they survive and how many times they reproduce and how many offspring they have. Let's think about the fact that selection acts also on individuals in the context of the population of which they are a part, okay? Now, populations are able to increase in number to some point, okay? And the growth rate, so this little r refers to the growth rate of a population. And this growth rate might be dependent on population density, okay? Now, in exponential growth, we don't have any limitation on population density, right? The population increases in size over time, and there are just more and more and more and more individuals of that population undergoing exponential growth over time, okay? And you can see how quickly this exponential growth curve goes up. And what does that mean? If there are more and more and more individuals, it means they are more and more tightly packed within whatever environment they inhabit, to the point that they presumably will reach some maximal carrying capacity. They cannot, exist shoulder to shoulder to shoulder, if I'm to use a human example, in their environment. So most populations will grow rapidly, okay, exponentially for a short period of time. But if you give them enough time, they will reach what we call a carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity is denoted by the letter K. And this is the maximal size that the population can be, okay? So I want you to think about something like mountain lions, okay? How many mountain lions can there be in the western United States? Could there be an infinite number of mountain lions such that if I walked out into my backyard, I might see 2, and there are 2 in every person's backyard? There are that many mountain lions? Certainly not, because there's not enough food for them to eat. So I want you to think about this logistic growth curve. Think about a population that has very few individuals initially, and they have all the resources in that habitat available to them. So they have high survival. They produce lots of offspring. Lots of those offspring survive and produce lots of offspring themselves. And so you can understand why the initial part of this logistic growth curve ramps up considerably. Okay. And even if you were to crop the y axis of this graph, make it half as tall as it is, it would look like the exponential growth curve. But what happens over time is the population starts overcrowding. No longer are the resources unlimited. And now individuals are experiencing competition for those limited resources. And so it becomes harder for individuals to get enough resources to survive and reproduce. They start having fewer offspring as a consequence. Those offspring have lower survival. And the population levels off at some maximal level of population density. Okay. So I want you to think about that when you look at something like this graph, right? You've certainly heard about the concerns about human population growth. Look at the number of humans on this planet over time for the past 10,000 years. Okay? For the first 10,800 years of this graph, we were below 1 billion humans on this planet. But since we've developed agricultural and industrial production capabilities, the human population has increased dramatically. Okay. So are populations able to sustain an exponential pattern of growth indefinitely? I think you've probably watched enough sci-fi movies that suggest this. There might be alternative scenarios that end up happening. Not to suggest that any of those are necessarily scientifically accurate or predictive, but I think you understand the limitations of our planet on our ability to produce food and house people and provide for them. So when we talk about populations that are undergoing or exist under these two different circumstances, they might be categorized as being either R selected or K selected. So populations that experience exponential growth, your text uses the example of weeds. Okay, weed populations experience exponential growth. If you cut down a forest, all the weeds go out there and just go nuts and increase in number exponentially. Okay, but at some point, the trees grow back and the weeds disappear, right? So the population disappears. Okay, a K-selected species experiences logistic growth, reaching that carrying capacity and maintaining a stable population level over time. Now, what happens in K-selected species over long time scales? It does appear that selection can drive evolution of a higher K. Okay, so this is an example of populations of flies, right? Fruit flies are a model organism for a reason. Populations of flies that were bred successively generation after generation at very high density. And you can see that the number of flies in these populations slowly increases over time. Blue and red just represent two different replications of the same experiment. And so how does that carrying capacity of the population increase? Well, individuals within the population are selected to become better at not only getting resources, but if it's crowded, and there's a set amount of resources, they can't become necessarily any better at getting them because they're all being gotten. They become better at metabolizing and utilizing those resources. Okay, so they're selected for increased metabolic efficiency, for example. Okay, so populations can evolve higher carrying capacity through natural selection. All right. So now I want to move on to, I want you to think about an oak tree. Okay. The oak trees in the grove, they produce zillions and zillions of acorns, and those acorns fall to the ground. And if you walk around right now, you can see a lot of 4-inch oak trees growing. I've got them all over my yard here. Okay. Now, are those, which do you think has a higher mortality rate? Which is more likely to die this year? The adult large oak tree or the little tiny 4-inch oak tree growing out of the ground? Okay. The mortality rate of adult trees is incredibly low. They do not die very quickly. So every year they have a very low chance of dying. And at these later points in their life, when they have very low mortality rates, they can reach enormous size and be incredibly fecund. They can produce enormous numbers of offspring. So, for that reason, organisms with very low mortality rates at greater ages, it behooves them to postpone reproduction to those later times when they are larger and can produce more offspring. All right, now we're going to come back to an example that we spoke about before, and that is the guppies of Trinidad. You might remember that image from the top right of this slide. So this is one in which I showed you some experiments where they moved guppies around in different ponds that did or did not have predators. Well, it won't surprise you to learn that there were also experiments on these same guppy populations that looked at the age of maturity, sexual maturity. So these graphs down at the bottom focus on when males reach sexual maturity, at what age do females give birth for the first time, and how fast do the populations grow quickly. Now, the example is very good in your text. It's very well explained. It's a pretty complex scenario, and I want you to read through this example and make sure it makes sense to you in the context of populations that are either R or K selected. Okay? Because it has everything to do with the environment in which these guppies have evolved, whether there's a lot of predation in the pool in which they live, or whether there's low or no predation in the pool in which they live. And that affects their population growth rate. And it's pretty remarkable. Okay? So the population density is much higher, the figure B, the predation, high predation and low predation rates, you see high density populations having lower population growth rates than populations that exist at low density. Okay, so these three graphs relate to the guppy example on page 284. I encourage you to read through that example. I just don't think it can be effectively explained through a recorded slide. Okay. Now let's touch on the evolution of how often do organisms reproduce, because we see a great deal of variation in that. Some organisms, you might think very simple organisms are the ones that reproduce once and die, and more complex organisms reproduce many times, like you. Okay, human might reproduce multiple times, but very advanced organisms like salmon here reproduce only once. And in this instance, in this case, this semiparous lifestyle is because the reproductive act itself is so difficult and taxing on this species. These fish have to go from the ocean up these rivers. You've probably seen videos of them jumping up these waterfalls and rapids, and the bears are eating them. It's a very difficult journey. And during this journey, they basically shut down everything else in their body. Their immune system is gone. They put everything into swimming upstream and producing eggs or sperm. That's it. They get up there, they do it, and they die. That was their one shot at reproduction. Okay. Now, like the lizard example, lizard and snake example I just showed you, if you look down at the bottom left, figure A, we can consider why organisms might be selected for iteroparous reproduction, or reproducing multiple times throughout their life. This can happen when organisms live in an environment that is highly variable and fluctuates quite a bit. Maybe this year isn't a great year to reproduce. Well, if everybody dies this year and they have to reproduce this year and everybody has a bad year, the species could go extinct. And so organisms that live in highly variable or fluctuating environments are selected for iteraparis reproduction. Remember also from the lizard and snake example that organisms that have lower mortality as adults would be selected for iteraparis or multiple reproductive events and delayed reproduction. We can also see here in figure A that as organisms become larger, they produce more offspring. Okay, so there's a clear relationship between the size and number of fruits that these plants produce. Now, in the iteraparis species, realize that they're going to get to reproduce next season and the season after and the season after that. So they are necessarily putting less reproductive effort into each reproductive season, okay? Because they will be reproducing multiple times. The salmon, on the other hand, they're one and done. They produce lots of offspring in that one shot, okay? That's how they maximize their fitness. If you look at figure B on the bottom right, comparing two closely related plant species, one of which is an annual, it lives and dies within a season and leaves seeds behind, like I described on the first slide. Compare that with a species that is a perennial. It comes back every year, produces seeds every year, produces offspring every year. Look how much reproductive effort these annual species use or expend compared to the reproductive effort that the perennial species expend. Annual species are expending much more reproductive effort in their reproduction than the perennial species are. And that's okay. So let's think about fecundity. What about the number of offspring? Why don't elephants have 10 babies? Okay. Why doesn't a bird, which birds are nesting here right now, why don't they have more babies than they do right now? Why doesn't a cardinal build a nest the size of your laptop and have 40 babies in it? Okay. It's because there's some optimal number of offspring that are produced by each species. And what plays into determining that optimal number is, let's say it's a bird that has to sit on a nest. Well, how big is that bird? Can it sit on and keep warm enough eggs? How many mouths does it have to feed? You've probably seen baby birds like this. When the mother comes around or the father comes around to feed them, they sit there with their mouths open, begging for food. Well, one or two parents can only feed so many offspring. And so this has been studied in a species of bird called the great tit. And I've got a graph down here that I apologize for the poor reproduction, but it was a good figure, bad quality that I was able to find of this. If you look at the relative fitness of individuals that produce different size broods, so birds that have 2 eggs have a relative fitness of about 0.4. They have 40% of the fitness of the best genotype. If you produce 4 offspring, your relative fitness is somewhere in the order of 0.8. Okay? You produce 13 offspring, it's pretty high, maybe 0.9. The highest fitness is right above 8. So 8 to 8.5 offspring is the optimal number of offspring for great tits to produce. And it's not just how many they have, right? Remember, we've talked about this. It's also about how many of those survive. You can have 14 offspring, but how many of those 14 offspring are actually going to survive? On average, not as many as if you only have 8 and only try to feed 8. If you're trying to feed 14, every individual of those 14 is going to get less food. They're going to be smaller. They're going to be weaker than the individuals that are being raised in a nest with only 8 offspring. Okay. Interesting snail, and then an example, of course, with no sex change, right? That's very basic. That's us. But the example of the snail is one in which females increase in size over time, and the larger they are, the more offspring they have. And so males It's just a remarkable example. You've got to read about it because females carry around a bunch of males on their back, and when the female dies, the biggest male on her back becomes the female, and the male on his back becomes the male that will fertilize him. Okay. Really remarkable examples. I just want you to go through these. These are pretty cool. And you should be able to differentiate those too. All right. So, with respect to specialists and generalists, this is a way in which we can categorize organisms that have different life history strategies with respect to how they approach their environment, how they interact with their environment. What temperatures can they handle? What can they eat? What environment can they live in? Okay. So specialists have very narrow ecological niches, right? The environmental envelope that they can tolerate. They generally require these very specific things, whether it's the things that they eat or the environmental conditions in which they survive. Okay. Generalists, on the other hand, have a very broad niche. They can tolerate damn near anything. They can eat lots of things. They can tolerate a wide range of temperatures. So in the bottom example here, we've got crabs. And the blue crab on the left is a species that lives in brackish and salt water. And while blue crabs can tolerate a wide range of salinity in the water that they're in, you can find them in backwaters, you can find them in canals, you can find them out in the ocean. The lady crab on the right is much less tolerant of salinity fluctuations. Okay. The caterpillar example above, A and B, is another example where the caterpillar on the left eats only junipers. The caterpillar on the right can eat all sorts of different plants, many different trees. So this is the difference between a species that specializes on one thing to eat, in the example of the caterpillar, or specializes in a very, very specific environment, in the example of the crab. So why might some individual species be more tolerant of fluctuating or a wide range of environments than others? And what we're looking at here is a plot of the temperature tolerance of frogs, and it's plotted across latitude. So the further to the left we are on this plot, the closer we are to the equator, meaning the warmer it is. Okay, the warmer temperatures these species are accustomed to. The further to the right you get, the closer you are to the North Pole. Okay, so frogs across the range from 0 to 50 is their critical temperature max, their maximum temperature that they can tolerate. Do you see much difference in the maximum temperature they can tolerate? There's really no difference, right? There's not much change across latitude of the maximum temperature they can tolerate. But if you look down at the critical minimum temperature, CT min, as you move north from the equator north, you will see that the critical minimum temperature decreases to below freezing. So at latitude 10, okay, that average is somewhere around, let's say, 9 degrees centigrade. Okay. Whereas as you get up to latitude 40 to 50, we're much closer to zero or below zero. Okay. So frogs that experience less fluctuation in temperature, so frogs near the equator, they don't experience a lot of variation, so they're much more specialized to a very narrow range of temperatures compared to species that live at northern latitudes and are exposed to more variation in temperature. So if you think about generalists, things that can tolerate a wide range of things and eat a wide range of things, why would selection drive any species to be a specialist? Well, if you think about the advantage of specialization, you've probably heard this phrase, jack of all trades, master of none. If an organism is a generalist and it can basically, let's say, inhabit any environment, or eat any particular thing, it's less able to hold its own and defend the territory in which it lives or defend the food resources that it needs to survive if something comes in that is specialized and is better than that generalist at eating that specific thing or living in that specific place. So when you're a specialist, if you eat only junipers as a caterpillar, and you are the only caterpillar that eats junipers, that means all the junipers are yours. You don't have to share them with anyone else. Contrast that with the species that eats many species of plants, and it runs into issues in that it's competing with other caterpillars on those plants, in addition to possibly other species that don't like the caterpillar being on those plants. So some plants have ants that defend them, for example. Okay, so when an organism specializes, as these flower piercers do, so this is a group of birds that has this unusually hooked beak that allows them to pierce the flowers and get the nectar that's inside those flowers. So there's a trade-off. If you become specialized and really good at accessing one food resource, it can come at the expense of no longer being able to access other resources that you used to access. But if you're the only one eating this new thing that you've specialized upon, that's great. Okay? But the assumption is that if you didn't have this specialization, you might be a bit more generalized. Experimentally, this has been demonstrated with flower piercers because they collected birds and clipped their beaks a bit. So look down at the bottom of the right side of this figure, and you can see that the beaks were clipped to have no hook on the left, a moderate hook in the middle, or maintain the really long hook on the right. Okay. Now, let's look at how much they ate from this purple flower that produces nectar, or this, what's indicated by the green line, a plant that produces fruit that they could consume. The individuals on the right with the long flower-piercing beak ate mostly this purple flowered nectar, right? So you can see that that purple bar is quite high. So more than, let's say 50%, let's say, of what they eat came from that purple flower. Now all three versions of the bird ate from this lobelia. About 20% of their diet came from this lobelia. The individuals with no modification to their beak got about 50% of their diet or milligrams per second, 50 milligrams per second from the purple flower, and they got a fair bit, but not very much, from this Leandra species on the top. Okay. What's interesting is the more you trimmed that beak back, the less they consumed from that purple flower, right? That purple flower, you have to kind of poke a hole in the back of the flower and get at that nectar if you're a bird, because they don't have long beaks like a hummingbird. That's what they use that piercer for. You remove the piercer, they get less out of that purple flower. They get more from Leandra. Okay? So they modify their feeding habits based on whether or not they have this specialized trait. Okay? So there is a trade-off in whether or not they're able to access this Leandra food resource when they have this specialized beak. You remove it, they can go back and get it, but they're getting less resources from the purple flower. Okay, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how selection acts on populations to make them become more specialized. Okay, and the example in your text explains how a population could become a specialist even when there are resources and alleles present that would permit or promote generalization. Okay. Your text explains this in a scenario in which there's a population of a species that feeds on two different plants, here illustrated by X and Y. X is much more common than Y. And in this population, the species feeds on X and Y. And there are mutations that make it beneficial to feed on X. And there's a mutation in the population that makes it beneficial if you feed on Y. You have lots more offspring, okay, in both of these instances. But because X is more abundant, the plant, so X is the plant in the population, and there's lots more of it to eat than there is of Y. Because it's more abundant in the population, more individuals in the population can live and grow on X than on Y. They will necessarily produce more offspring than the individuals that grow and do well on Y. And over time, the population is going to evolve specialization to eat exclusively X simply because there's more of it. Not because it's better to grow on X and eat X. It's simply because there's more X around in the population, and despite the fact that two different mutations were equally advantageous, the abundance of one resource relative to the other leads to species specialization on that resource. Introduces you to what I'm having you read outside of the text and the lecture that I'm giving you. And this is really interesting in the context of what's happening right now with human populations. But this is an article that was written nearly 7 years ago about human population size and how that is going to play out, or what the predictions were with respect to disease outbreaks as population size grows. So I'm posting the link to this article in Blackboard, and I want you to think about what's going on now with the coronavirus pandemic, and think about what the continued growth of human population size means with respect to this. Okay, that's all.